Gowing, who will moderate and facilitate the exercise today. Again, I'd like to invite those of you who are in the back, would welcome you and to join a table. Okay, well, great. Thank you, everyone. I'm going to now turn it over to Nick Gowing, who will give us a little bit of overview of the activity today. And just to remind everyone, this 40th anniversary, of the annual meeting, the theme, of course, is a call to action, improve the state of the world, and I think you've all picked up the tagline of rethink, redesign, and rebuild. We're really very much counting on you to really lead us through a rethink exercise, but also an exercise that will take us also towards the redesign. Because I think clearly one shared sentiment is the fact that there are a number of global issues that indeed do need to be rethought, but more importantly, the institutions today, many of them designed in the 20th century, are not necessarily fit for purpose, and therefore has to be, as well as an effort at redesign. And I hope that we can get through the rethink exercise. I hope that we can touch on the redesign as well, and certainly that process will help us rebuild those institutions, I hope, that can help address these challenges. And so we're very grateful for you. It's a very important exercise for the forum because this, in a way, gives us a lot of guidance on really what are the core shared global issues that we need to rethink. And certainly, we're also counting on you to actually have a real debate about how you can get to some of the governance gaps, address them, but also consider the redesign elements as well. So now I'll turn it over to Nick.
Thanks, Lee. Don't go away, because there may be other issues you need to explain. What we have here is 29 tables with 8 delegates on, 8 of those of you who are now here in Davos, plus a 9th who's a member of the forum, who is the person who's going to make sure that what you decide are the keywords are then posted electronically in a way that we can then post it on a tag cloud in about 45 minutes from now. So 8 to a table, and there is a grouping. There is an attempt to put some of you together in areas where there's a degree of commonality. What we're talking about here is a mismatch, really, between governance at the moment, the institutions of the 20th century, and the challenges and issues of the 21st century. And the central phrase and sentence which we need you to bear in mind is the working definition of global commons, shared globally for the common good, but beyond national jurisdiction or private ownership. What is shared globally but not managed properly or effectively with the current institutions at the moment? In other words, getting above the sovereign, the national, and the institutional level. To try and focus on that as you try and define the common grounds. And you will be allowed up to 10 thoughts. Each should be a self-contained single word, but there are 1 or 2 phrases which could justify 2 words, which actually will still be 1 word. Now, what I need to be clear about, Lee, is what should happen on every table, particularly with those who've been involved with the design initiative up to this point, of which there are up to 3 on every table.
And Nick, as you mentioned, a number of you have been very active as members of the network of Global Agenda Councils. These are 76 councils that were created to really address important global, regional, and industry issues. Many of you met, of course, in Dubai and worked with your councils and really surfacing what you thought was something that ought to be discussed in Davos, and we're very grateful for your contribution to date to the program. But many of you are involved in the context of the Global Agenda Council's work with the Global Redesign Initiative, which is exactly what you said, Nick, is really looking at where are the governance gaps today and how should we rethink and redesign and possibly re-architect some of the institutions and processes to address them. So really, there are people here among you as discussion leaders who've been working on this really since a year now. Others, of course, like-minded cohorts at your table as well, I think are very much aware and engaged on this issue as well. And so we'd like to really tap into that, and hence the focus this year on the World Economic Forum Brainstorming.
So the first task is in the first 30 minutes, introduce yourselves, and then move very swiftly on to trying to define these common grounds. It'll come easily to some tables with more challenge on other tables. But let's try it in 30 minutes. It's an experiment to see what you can come up with, and then those words should be fed to the member of the forum staff who are on your table, who can then feed it in, and at that point we'll move into plenary and try and work out what your reactions are to the level of bias, the level of weight that's given within the tag cloud to certain words, certain phrases, certain concepts. But as Lee said just before the beginning, it's not scientific. It's not a vote either. So it is about grabbing ideas at this stage before we move into design and rebuilding. Anything to add, Lee?
No.
Okay, 30 minutes, introduce yourselves, and then at about 2:10, let's work out where the tag cloud is leading us.
Which is a good way to start off with you.
demand for everybody. And the program for doing that has been worked out in this commission, which I co-chair, which is just this report. So there's one. So two, nuclear terrorism.
And to some extent, it's the first one and the third one that are the most challenging for us, because the social goods, you can say, quite often is still built within the nation state and so forth. It's less transnational than some of the others. Swine flu or whatever, that's crossing over. It's a little bit more contained.
Could I just take 15 seconds, and I urge you now to start defining the key words or the key two-word phrases, which you can then submit from your table, and try and round off your discussions in about the next 10 minutes, please.
But there's something, if we want to push through the kind of angle of equality, gender equality, can one not make the gender, race, kind of those equality things get more, or we take them separately, gender equality.
Ladies and gentlemen, we've only had three table submissions. Could I urge you to move to that stage, please, so we can then move on?
It's a variation on the transparency to some extent.
I'm submitting what? Yes? The submissions, please.
What do you mean, welcome to?
We've got a guy with us who does these things, you know. He does these kind of
Could I urge you, please, to set yourself a 2-minute deadline, get those words in, otherwise we won't be able to have the discussion which we're planning, and we're already 1 minute away from the deadline we set half an hour ago. Not coming up in order. One more time, please. There are about 10 tables which have yet to submit. Please, could you focus and take that brave decision on those words? I'm sorry. All right. Let's focus now, if we can, on the next stage, please. We've got submissions from all 28 tables, 27 tables actually, because two tables we had to merge because the numbers weren't quite big enough. We're now trying to create a tag cloud of the keyword entries that you've all made. You can work out the maths of that. That'll take a little bit of time. Let's try and go through the kind of focus that there was on many of your tables. Remember, this is unscientific, but it's giving us a signal of the kind of priorities you think there are, certainly for the rethink, and we can maybe in the next 45 minutes move into elements of redesign for the next 3 or 4 days, if you want to put those on the table. Let me just go to 3 or 4 tables, if I can, to get a sense of what was being talked about. Ian Golden, could you, from your table, please give us a sense of what you came up with and why, and what the priorities were in the discussion?
We had a very rich discussion, and we've tried to identify some things that we thought others wouldn't. So we've put, for example, global human rights, culture and values as high up on our list. And we've put as well the things that others would, I'm sure, put: climate, oceans, stopping global pandemics, food security, global peace, trade and finance, global mobility, that includes migration and refugees, failed states as being a key area, being the other one. Thank you.
And are you convinced, is your table convinced, Ian, that all of those are really not being addressed as global commons at the moment? In other words, they're above the institutions that exist?
Well, there are some of them that are being addressed. The institutions on human rights, the institutions, for example, that try and deal with failed states. But certainly they're not being dealt with in a way that would give us satisfaction that those are up to the challenge of the 21st century.
All right, fine. Jonathan Zittrain, can I come to your table, please, about the kind of things that have come out from you? Please, the microphone there.
Hi there. At our table, we spoke a bit about a unified, freely accessible, interoperable internet.
Do you need to repeat that?
It'll cost you.
Hang on, is that 10 keywords or
that
5 keywords or
one concept, but
okay.
We're ready to point out that Table 8 only had 7 words, and we wanted to help them out with 3 extra.
Give me those words again, please.
An unified, freely accessible, interoperable internet. I know that we have one person here. We actually have the chair of the Marketing and Branding Council at the table, and I want to point out that he dissented from our use of this phrase. But that includes under it free language translation tools available to all, and cybersecurity. We also thought that truth was a commons, and under truth we would put access to news, cultural history, scientific knowledge, and liberal arts and vocational education.
And how would that be adjudicated at an international level in a better way than it is at the moment?
We arrived at the observation that we had no earthly idea, but that we were aspiring to come up with one and thought that that might be our next 30-minute task.
In that case, I might come back to you. Lilia Shetsova, where are you? Table 25, somewhere at the back. Lilia, where are you? Hand up, please. Yeah. All right, please. All right.
Okay, we had an interesting discussion. We used a bit of time also discussing what is a common and what is not.
Was it clear?
Well, it's not clear. I mean, we have some economists on the table. They think it's clear, and the rest of us are not so sure. Now, we have a few...
Did you reject the concept at all?
No, we did not reject the concept. We maybe wanted to include a bit more into the concept than what the economists would accept. But we have a few words. Climate change is a big one. Internet, global financial system, population, oceans, human rights, security, and rainforests. Those were some of the areas that our table was concerned with.
But were you able to be more specific? I'm seeing, I've got a screen up there before it comes in the tag cloud. A lot of these are issues which are already being addressed at some point in some part of the world. Can you be a little more specific on those you chose? In other words, taking it to another level which needs to be addressed which isn't being addressed at the moment.
Right. We didn't get that far in the discussion, and we thought that was going to be the next step.
Yeah.
How do we address this? But we did discuss, can we include areas such as values, other things such as poverty, which we think is very important, but it doesn't really fit this global commons model. But these are some of the areas that we identified as there are gaps here in the system of administering these areas. So that was sort of identifying the gaps part, and then we thought we would come to more the solution part afterwards.
All right, we're still in a holding pattern before we get the tag cloud, which will give us a little more of a statistical guide to the kind of consensus that's emerging. David Kennedy.
So we had three groups of issues. First, we were all of the view that although it's been talked about many, many times, we ought not to take the new call for commons as a reason to ignore aspects of soil, air, and water, which remain very important and inadequately addressed common challenges for the world. Secondly, a series of issues which we felt had inadequately been attended to as common problems, things which show up as problems in one or another place, but actually concern us all. And there our tag words were safety, solidarity, and sustainability. And we had in mind things like migration, poverty, the inequality in the distribution of knowledge and science and so forth, which could be regarded as common problems. Having such a long list of problems in those two categories, we then, for a third group of issues, all felt that some aspects of the global governance structure itself, a robust capacity for both leadership, rulemaking, and policy formation at the global level was a common heritage, a common component of our global life together that would be necessary to address any of those things and was at the moment in some short supply.
Were you addressing simply failings at the moment or new opportunities you're seeing?
Well, I think we were, people had picked these issues thinking in both directions. I think there was a feeling generally at the table, and other members of the group may want to jump in, that there had been a lack of coordinated and robust governance on these issues that were and ought to be of common concern, but that there were bright spots in a number of areas. Some aspects of ocean management had worked better than others. Some aspects of a variety of different environmental projects showed promise of potential forward motion, even if we were not at the point of thinking there was going to be a universal solution.
Let me invite, we've got about 10 minutes before the tag cloud will emerge electronically. Let me invite anyone to come in here to build on these deficiencies that there are there. Anyone wants to come in, several of you, I hope, to explain the kind of deficiencies which you are identifying on your tables. Please. And could you just identify yourselves? There's nothing prescriptive here. I'd like to hear it from as many voices as possible. One here, one there, one here, microphone, and plenty of hands. Thank you. I'll come to you all.
Okay.
Good, please.
Two things we discussed was, one, that there is a connection between global commons and global systemic risk. And that actually might challenge the notion that global commons is defined by national jurisdiction. Example, the Amazon rainforest is of global systemic importance to the world, and yet it is under national jurisdiction of a number of countries. Can that be like that? Should it be like that? Because people who are dependent on climate worldwide are dependent on what happens in the Amazon. The second was that we were discussing at our table biodiversity as an obvious global commons, but within that, could we agree, here was the question, on the genetic makeup of natural species, that is a common good. And there we found that we actually got difficulty to come to an agreement at the table, because where do you exactly draw the line? And this is actually a frontier question when it comes to defining common goods versus private ownership.
Same question to you, which I put to David Kennedy. Was it about identifying failings or new opportunities and necessities?
I think it's both. It's the same. It is the flip side of the same coin: risk and opportunities. Risk certainly with the Amazon and its impact on climate.
Right.
Opportunity also private or public ownership of genetic makeup of natural species.
All right, hand the microphone back there. There are other microphones. Just get the microphone too. Don't wait for me to point it in your direction. Please, who's got it here?
One of the topics that we got to as we were going through the list was the cause for the increase in.
Could you keep the microphone a little closer to you, please?
Global commons. What are the causes? So as there's more interdependencies, as there is more interconnectedness, that the magnitude of commons are going to continue to increase. And so we wanted to make sure that there was an opportunity to actually talk about that and recognize that issue. If I go to one specific that hasn't been mentioned, how does the world respond to catastrophic events? If you think about what has happened in Haiti, and is there a coordinated response that will be the most efficient, the best way, so that the spillover effect, the adverse effect that goes beyond the boundaries of that area where the catastrophe has occurred, how do we work through that?
We're trying to identify those capacities still lacking. Pass the mic back. You've got the mic over there.
Howard Alper, I'll just summarize for our group, and some of the words are the same. I'll just mention those first. Biodiversity, water, global security, demography or population, digital infrastructure. But in addition, we thought literacy is very important as a global commons. Talk about reducing poverty, you need to enhance education, and literacy is a prerequisite for that. Space is another issue that's crucial, looking to the future. You were asking about the future versus the past, and that is looking to the future. Nutrition, energy, and related to an issue, a session this morning, wellness. It happened to be on chronic diseases, non-communicable. But wellness, promotion, and prevention of disease is as important as treatment of disease. So there are some new elements.
Any ideas for redesign on literacy particularly?
Yeah, in terms of type of delivery of education, methodology, learning, the learning method. There are modern techniques now developed in the last 5 to 10 years that merit attention. And so this is a potential recipe for a redesign.
Okay, forward to Kishore and then Don Tapscott.
Okay, we had a bunch that others had, airspace, high seas, sunlight, and so on. But there were 3 that it's unlikely other groups had. I'll explain each. Sustainable practices, environmental warning systems, and toxic financial assets. Let me explain those. Okay, sustainable practices. Every company has all kinds of intellectual property having to do with reducing energy, reducing carbon, improving business processes that enable a green environment, and so on. Why not be like Nike, who announced this morning the creation of the Green Exchange, which is a commons for all of this IP. Nike's giving away 400 patents on the idea that A, a rising tide lifts all boats, B, this will help them reduce their own costs because people will build upon their intellectual property and they have rights to get it back. And for certain things, you can develop a licensing agreement whereby you give away some killer IP, you actually get a revenue stream back. So that's the first one, sustainable practices. 2, environmental warning systems. This is not shared across the world. So some environmental agency in the United States may well have knowledge about some catastrophe that's going to happen in some other part of the world, and that does not get communicated. All of these should be placed in the commons where we can have an open source of environmental data to avoid catastrophes, and like earthquakes. And the third is, right now there are about $1 trillion, plus or minus $1 trillion, of toxic assets sitting on the balance sheet of all these banks that nobody knows what their value is. This is preventing us from rebooting the global economy. You can't mark them to market because there is no market. You can't mark them to model because who's going to trust the banks to say what these assets are worth? Why not place them in the commons whereby the world can view them and develop rating systems to evaluate them so we can understand what these real assets are worth, dispose of them, and free up the whole global economy?
Okay, Don, we're getting redesigned. Shift the microphone back. Let's run this for a few more minutes. Kishore, and over here, I'm going to come to you, Kishore, first, and then we're going to go this way. Yep, please, Kishore.
Thank you. Just, the largest global commons conference that failed recently was Copenhagen. We all have 1,000 theories on why Copenhagen failed. But if you want me to suggest one fundamental structural reason why Copenhagen failed, is because the Western-dominated global order has not learned how to share power, how to share custodianship of the global commons with the new rising powers, especially China and India. It was striking how closely China and India, despite all their political differences, worked so closely together in Copenhagen because they felt that in the efforts to regulate the global commons, the interests of China and India were being ignored.
Fine.
So until you get common custodianship, you'll have a problem.
Right. I just want to literally get a bite-sized sample of other ideas which are coming up before we go to the tech cloud. Please, and then the
Thank you.
microphone.
We differentiated between public goods and the kinds of things that a global commons could serve. And we came to the conclusion that the global commons were narrower than public goods. So, for example, it's more infectious disease than public health, or it's better to think of, in the commons, basic education rather than education as a whole. We thought that there were three characteristics that are important for global commons. First is that there needs to be a responsibility to maintain. Second is that there will be a need for standards. And third is that if the responsibility to maintain and the needs for standards are not there, then there would be a systemic collapse that needs to be avoided. So the global commons you would want are those that avoid system collapse through systems for responsibility to maintain and the use of standards.
Thank you. Pass the microphone back.
Building on the last two comments, our table also talked quite a lot about global governance and global governance institutions, and recognize that, in fact, if we are going to be able to effect a global commons, a key missing factor has to be a more democratic, a more accountable, a more unified, and a more shared global governance institutional architecture. And by that, we mean how you think about United Nations, World Bank, IMF, and so on.
Okay, move the microphone across. Please, who's got it next?
Yes, so Dan Shapiro. Our table focused primarily on the global commons issue of security. And three major themes emerged. One was the theme solve, don't manage. The idea that around many of these crisis situations, there's a charade of response that serves some interests at the leadership level, perhaps not many of the people's interests, the constituency interests. Along those lines, the notion came up of DARE, taking exercising the courage to actually create new institutions. One person mentioned J Street as one possible institution, demonstrative institution. Second, justice came up, and there was the notion of ending impunity, double standards around issues of conflict, security, and beyond. And third was the issue of enabling bottom-up solutions.
Thank you. Move the microphone. Who's got it here, please?
Yeah, two things. First of all, the three-tier of space, biosphere, and then oceans and forests and land, those typical problems of spelling it out right from space downwards. But then secondly, population, with a second group, put population on. If we don't solve poverty for moral reasons or economic reasons, both of which are really good reasons why we should, there's such good evidence that a very small increase in income for the poorest people on the planet in education reduces population fertility rates dramatically. And so if we want less than 9 billion people on the planet and affecting us all, then we need to take that seriously. It's a global problem we need to solve globally.
Thank you. Move across to Simon, please, over here. And then there are three people here as well.
Let me mention two that have not been mentioned so far, that the economists at the tables would typically say don't qualify as a commons, but arguably should be discussed. One is inclusive growth. There's a sense in which if most people in the world are perceiving some sense of improvement or satisfaction, that will be beneficial for everyone because of the increased capacity we'll have for making decisions that will be beneficial for everyone in the world. So it is something in which we all have a stake. The other was a process for taking knowledge and reaching a consensus about what's right or what's important. Precisely what we're trying to do here, and we do in many other fora, and our sense is that we don't have enough good mechanisms for taking all the different bits of knowledge that people have and reaching a consensus that could then be the basis for action.
Could that be managed at an international level, beyond national jurisdiction?
I think there's partly a research task there, analogous to the technology research tasks, which is to do experiments and get replicable knowledge about how to take broad groups of people, synthesize what they know, and get to some kind of workable consensus.
Right, I think we've got about 5 people left. Keep that microphone moving down there. Over here, please.
A couple of ideas that haven't been discussed from our table. First, this sort of access to energy as being key, and from our OPEC colleague here. So an interesting question about how to make sure that there is the access to it. Second idea, the open trade, a sort of backward movement on open trade because of terrorist threats, politicians' responses, and sort of the problem now with open trade. The other idea, important on the technology front, we kind of worked around the idea of what words would get it across best, and we came up with common framework on the internet, common standards. Kind of advances have been made when there are common standards in this sort of open-sourced kind of world. Leapfrogging kind of movements forward when there was at least accepted kind of frameworks where all could move forward on it.
All right,
The last one is disaster relief. The word we came up with was collective memory, how we can move ahead in these disaster reliefs and not reinvent each time. And in fact, examples of how people have moved ahead in some of these disasters to respond better.
I think you're talking about a black swan there in terms of institutional memory. Please. Simon Maxwell, then 2 or 3 here as well.
You didn't quite ask us to explain why, but it is clear that all the problems we face in the world are global and not only national or regional, and collective action theory tells us there are 4 problems we need to solve. 1, there's a lack of trust. 2, there is a lack of incentives for people to behave differently. 3rd, there is a lack of institutions to manage the process of getting to agreement. And 4th, and perhaps most frightening, there's a lack of time. Those are the 4 problems that we in this room need to solve.
Thank you, Simon. 4 lacks there.
Thank you. My name is Tony Hodge. I think a comment on the nature of the commons is that what came from our table was that it's not the bricks and mortar of the internet, it's access, and it's in fact access that can be managed. Now, in thinking about some of the themes that have come from these tables that were also expressed here, it strikes me that a very key characteristic of the commons is that different values around the world will have different perceptions of significance of the commons. And the difficulty linked to what was just said here right now, the difficulty is that the processes that are need to find common ground between the expression of different values are not currently considered part of the commons, processes that can bring the respect and trust, but should be considered part of the commons.
Thank you. Who's got the microphone there? 2 or 3 more, then I'm going to reveal the tag cloud.
We also, building on a theme that's been repeated of knowledge as a fundamental element of the commons, but not all aspects of knowledge. It's knowledge that gets translated into evidence about what works and what doesn't work. That's fundamentally important. I mean, it was mentioned with relation to disasters, this idea of institutional memory, but it can be applied to almost any field. It's too expensive to keep repeating mistakes or not learning from others' mistakes or failing to learn from other successes. And that's a process that can be managed and where there's fundamental shortcomings in the current institutional architecture.
Thank you. Who else had their hand up here, please? One more hand. Any more? A second there. Have you got a microphone? And then I'll go to the computer.
Dennis Snower. One idea in our table that came up that was perhaps unique was the idea of global social norms. Over the past 100 years, we've been swept by a norm of democracy, of greater sensitivity to human suffering and so on. And the next step our table thought would be to pursue a common global norm concerning freedom and human rights and interpersonal respect.
Thank you. Please.
Yes, Steve Schneider. One of the things our table did in the request to do a micro Twitter in 2 or 3 words was avoid over exploitation of those various spheres that everybody has been mentioning. But the one thing that we didn't have time to develop, though it was mentioned, is that the word over itself is value-laden, and therefore you're going to have, as part of the international dialogue, not simply the solutions, is it cap versus trade, but what are the values that people are doing, and when those are fundamentally in disagreement, sweep them under the rug is where you lose the trust. So I think that we have to start from common shared values and then move along, and I don't think that's something we've done very well at the COPs, for example.
Remember, we're trying to just capture a spirit and thinking at this particular point here in Davos. Let's go to the tag cloud and see what that shows. Wow. Well, the principle here is the spatial positioning doesn't mean anything. It's the size of the word that matters most. In which case, between you, with 27 tables, each making a choice of up to 10, have essentially thought of water, oceans, human rights, space, and air as the most significant global commons which are in need of tackling urgently as part of a redesign. I'll repeat that. Water, oceans, human rights, space, and air. Now, we can't argue over any kind of ordering that there might be, which is explicit or implicit in what is up there. And all this is going to be on the website. I did try and get hard copies to put in front of you so you could mull it over and then come up with some great grand idea in the next 20 or 30 minutes. We can't actually do that in the time available. But if you can read that, that's the map that you have created in the last 1 hour in this room. What does it tell us? We've got 20 minutes, and it's for you, between you, to somehow come up with some thinking on what, if anything, that tells us, what it tells us about priorities, what it tells us as well about the kind of standards and weaknesses which have been identified in the last 20, 25 minutes since we started discussing this. Would anyone like to venture? Would anyone like to enter that space and try and help clarify what that means? Because I certainly, from the chair, am not going to try and do that. I hope you can all read it. You probably can't read it very easily at the back. Rainforest, for example, is right at the top. Now, obviously, there are weaknesses in this, not least it depends which words you use and what kind of commonality can be created. And that would be done in filtering. Emma, are you going to tell me something? Oh, great. Okay, please. Do shout or put up a bit of paper, then I can at least see you. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We've got about less than 20 minutes, so please.
Robert Madeline, one thing which I think drove our table and which we must be careful of in the next step is, in a way, not doing something I think you almost invited us to do, which is to self-censor on what the commons are according to manageability. I think at this stage in a rethinking process, we have to accept that there may be some big issues which humanity can't today see the answer to. And it would be a tragedy if we then took them off the table and stuck with what we know, looking for the keys under the lamppost. And if I had to pick one example of the things I can read from here, take knowledge. Clearly, to unpack that, it's huge. Yeah. But to say it's too big to worry about would be a mistake. And some of the thoughts coming out around knowledge will prevent bad things, knowledge can enhance security, I think that's very important, because what's missing in global multi-stakeholder governance is the vision, the optimism, and a sustained commitment. So I would say that we should not filter by manageability, but we should filter by vision. We should look for a vision of the 21st century global commons, which will motivate people who currently don't care.
This is very imperfect, very incomplete. It's a snapshot. It's trying to bring together, dare I say, several conference sessions into one to act as a springboard to leap forward over the next couple of days.
Orville Schell, looking at this list, I think our table's reaction is very much
how do you deal with any of these things? And once you ask that question, I think what we concluded was that really there were 3 levels. You could deal with them globally, as the UN tried to deal with climate change in Copenhagen, or regionally, or nationally. And I think really what a conversation like this misses is where is the effective jurisdictional area for each of these, and if it doesn't exist, how do you bring it into being?
We need to know those weaknesses. Who else has that? Is that a hand going up? No, please, yes. Is that Don again?
Yes. By the way, I forgot one in our list. We had a unified, freely accessible, interoperable internet. But I think somebody else came up with that, though. Anyway.
Can you see it up there?
Yeah, the typing's a little small. I look at this and I see Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
A hierarchy of needs.
Should I explain that?
Please
you know,
do, yes.
Maslow, if a tiger is chasing you, the fact that nobody loves you is not really big on your mind. We need to drink water. We need air to breathe. The oceans are the foundation. The only one that's missing on there is food. And then, of course, human rights is essential to achieving all of that. So I'm not sure it's telling me an awful lot. Those are kind of the easy ones and the really big ones.
Okay, we're trying to find what the weaknesses are and what the scheme might be, please.
Yeah, there's clearly a lack of hierarchy there, but that's normal for this exercise.
By definition.
There's also some disaggregation. For instance, we have knowledge in one place, we have scientific knowledge, we have climate change, and then we have climate. So there's probably work we can do by just aggregating and sub-aggregating some of those elements. This being said, we have also a mix there between objectives and tools. Clearly, knowledge is one of those tools that will transcend the way in which we can manage many of those issues. And clearly, it seems that the next step would be to identify what in this aggregation is truly manageable objectives and what should be identified as tools to pursue them. And clearly what has been mentioned before about building trust, building institution, building incentives will be certainly key to identify what are the ways to address the gaps in the way in which those items are not being managed at an international level.
Please, who else over there?
Yes, Paul Romer described very well the discussion at our table about knowledge, which came up in terms like collective memory. And we did have the word collective intelligence. And it reflected a great sense of frustration, I would say, at this table. We probably spent too much time in section 1 on why are we doing this and where will it go. And I think the prior speaker to me just used Simon Maxwell's 4 lacks again. And I think it's worth repeating. Lack of trust, lack of incentives, in particular, for example, on pricing appropriately some of these common public goods like water. And it's a little bit, I think what we were talking about implicitly at this table was a lack of political intelligence about how to transfer the knowledge we have about what our collective action problems are into collective political action. And that has to do with the lack of institutions at the global level that are truly effective. So I would go back to those lacks, honestly, lack of trust, lack of incentives, lack of institutions, lack of time. I'd also like to add one personal note, which I think that this having global social norms is a great sort of common good. And it is one of the successes of globalization in the last 20 years. And the terrific example of that is the increase in the understanding of women's rights and women's status as a fundamental contribution to inclusive growth and possibly to the collective political intelligence that we haven't achieved yet in a world still run mostly by older white men.
I see.
That's meant to be humorous, not insulting.
Should I invite people to laugh? Who else? 3 or 4, and then we'll probably close, please. And then, who has a microphone? Who has a microphone? Please. Get the microphone to you.
All right. So I'm David Kenny from Publicis Group. I tend to look at this from a thematic standpoint. When you go to oceans, water, space, and air, I think what we're confronting is that our economy has to change from consumption to creation, because these are all finite resources where we're depleting. And the human rights issue is all about sharing and dividing scarce resource. And I think the dilemma is going to be, do we have solutions to create and reuse water and oceans to create space and do something with air, or not? And if we have to divide it, it's a different economic construct than we've had in the last century, which has been very much driven by consumption. And I don't think there's an answer on it. But I think the solution has to be to solve some creative answers for creation of resources, because if it's simply a matter of continuing to divide finite, then we're going to need a completely different system than the one we have.
I should say that on Sunday morning, that will be the basis to make a judgment as to what progress, if anything, has been made here at Davos on those three cardinal aims, starting here with this identification. Who else has got the microphone? Over there. You have there as well, please.
Okay, Mark Piet. I think looking at it from an analytical point of view, three things have to be done with this blurb. It's very interesting, the blurb itself, and the process is good, but it's an order. The first step would be order into the matters. I think there would be 4 areas that would have to be distinguished, and I think some have already been identified. One would be the essential preconditions of survival. And the second area would have to be identifying social goods. You then probably have to move on to say what are common values, and then there is a layer of institutions. What I think this does not yet do, of course, then is it just orders the words. You then have to ask yourself, well, what are the challenges? What are the risks that you're confronted with? And then what are the instruments available, the solutions? So basically you have 3 major tasks: order into the matters. Second task, identify the challenges and risks. And third task, find instruments, solutions. I'm not very sure that we'll, this is like a newspaper search of items that are bothering us at the moment. Useful, but next step is necessary.
So it's got to be much more sharply defined.
Could I just add from this group? If I look at that, it's interesting. A number of those things would have been already on the global agenda 60 years ago.
Indeed.
Some 30 years ago, and the others maybe in the last 10 years. What they all lack is a shared vision and common values. Ironically, the one standout is human rights, where there's been for 60 years a shared vision, common understanding of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and it's actually ironic that that one is so big and we've actually failed from that good basis to act on that.
Very good point. Yes, please.
Manoj Kohli from India. I'm really happy that such an intellectual discussion has led to very simple solutions. I think it is simple 3 conclusions. One is nature, save the nature. Nature is most important for us: water, oceans, climate, etc., etc. And I think all governments need to focus. Second, save the freedom, because people need freedom first and everything later. And more human rights need to be safeguarded. Third comes out what other gentlemen said, Maslow's hierarchy, the bottom of the Maslow's hierarchy of food, security, water, etc., etc. And I feel it's back to basics. You're basically saying that the world needs to be back to basics rather than making it intricate, making it complex. Let's not do that. Now, on the governance side, my comment is that majority of these things fall under national governance. I'll say 80-20 rule. 80% national, 20% international. And I'm saying 20% international because international governance has been very weak. All the international institutions have been ineffective, except for very few. And they are there because they need employment. A lot of people need employment. There is a trained incapacity in many of those institutions. Therefore, a lot of those institutions need accountability. At the end of the year, at the end of a quarter, they need to score yes and no. And if they don't, let me tell you, the balanced global issues will never be resolved.
Thank you. Please, anyone else? One here as well. 2, yeah.
Just to add to what has already been said, and without wishing to repeat, but the same point, 5 years ago, most of those would have been on the list, and in 5 years' time, they're still going to be there. So we're really talking about issues and challenges But in many ways, they will remain that unless you create preventative measures to do it. Now, 5 years ago, pandemics would have been a big one. But because of science research, competition with the pharmaceutical industries, they've come up with many, many solutions. Now, if one can apply that type of process to look at how one internationally can challenge a number of these issues, because we're talking about risks and how do we overcome risk.
Thank you. I can see 5 I'm going to recognize, and then I'm going to close the list. And I might come to Simon to ask how that, what reference that gives for his 4 lacks, as mentioned over there. Who's got the microphone next? Please, Jonathan, and move the microphone across here.
I guess when we began this exercise, many of us ended up gravitating towards listing big problems that were common to many or all of us. And when you look at the cloud, that's what that shows. I think you very helpfully pushed us to think about it as problems that might be special and that they require supranational or supra-institutional governance or structures to try to make progress on. And I guess just bringing the word commons back into it, when you think about how to make progress on them, one is to somehow harness self-interest, to use markets so that the way that money flows somehow does not deplete the commons we have here or even improves it. Another is essentially through the gun or regulations. Can we just make a rule and enforce it to preserve the commons? And I just wanted to emphasize there's also a third path latent, of course, which is that of goodwill. And I sense there's a lot of goodwill in the room and at the forum and in many other venues and institutions. And if we can just somehow create structures that allow us to reinforce the golden rule, know when someone is in trouble, and find a way to help, I know that's something that's been frustrating lately. That would be a great addition to the markets and to the regulation.
Please.
Yeah, I'd like to point out the cloud here has so many big words which relate to natural capital and to nature. And fundamentally, I think what we are acknowledging is that we've gone through a period where these things have been economically invisible. We've accepted fresh water, oceans, air, atmosphere, biodiversity, ecosystem services, all of those just as free goods. And I think that's fundamentally a recognition today that all of these need to be brought back to the table. So that is, in my opinion, an achievement. Human rights also is deeply connected, especially in terms of the wealth of the poor. A lot of that is natural wealth and their access to it.
Thank you. Can you pass the microphone across, please, to here, to Simon, to your left, please.
I'm Bill McDonough. I'm a designer. I think as you look at this, what we realize is design is a signal of human intention. And if this is a signal of intention, we realize that the design we have is a strategy of tragedy. And what we're talking about is being less bad. And what we need to be talking about is how to be more good. And there needs to be a goal setting here. And if the value set that comes out of this is that we want to love all the children of all species for all time, then we could look at this and say we need a goal. And clearly the goal that ties in all these pieces of this puzzle would be something like we seek a delightfully diverse, safe, healthy, and just world with clean air, water, soil, and power, economically, equitably, ecologically, and elegantly enjoyed.
Thank you.
Period.
Mike Osterholm, I'm chair of the Pandemics Council, so I just want to leave some information. And one of our previous colleagues said, please do not walk out of here believing that science has somehow enhanced our ability over the last several years to defeat the infectious diseases. Microbial genetics, which is defined by 20-minute reproduction times, actually has brought us further for many of the solutions, resistance and so forth, the organisms, and the global crowding of humans and animals into tight spaces and so forth. And so we actually have many more problems today than we had 10 years ago. We're just not hearing about them. And I wouldn't want anybody to leave here thinking that that's the answer, is science solving infectious diseases. Science is still important, but we have more challenges, not fewer today, with infectious diseases.
Thank you. Simon, last word before we get to 3 o'clock. Does that begin to address in any way the 4 lacks that you identified?
Well, it tells us what we need to do. I've stopped talking about global public goods. I talk about things we need to fix. Actually, the thing we need to fix is how do we fix the things we need to fix? And we can do it in different ways for each of these issues. But there are some key principles in play. The processes we use have to be efficient and effective, and they have to be accountable and democratic. And developing countries, the people I work with, are extremely nervous about deals done in smoke-filled rooms by large powers who don't consult and who don't share. And so the key issue for me is going to be about whether the UN is the right forum, or whether we can trust the G20 to be suitably inclusive, or whether we need the G2 as we did or didn't have in Copenhagen. That's the discussion we need to have. And the other thing I want to say is that these debates are not going to be won by the politics of fear. They're going to be won by the politics of hope. And so although I'm a great supporter of the risk work that the World Economic Forum does and use it all the time, actually what we need is a work stream at the WEF on opportunities. Because what we need to be able to demonstrate is that we will have a better world at the end of this, and that's the inspiring vision that will make change possible.
Thank you. If you're frustrated after 90 minutes, I don't apologize. This is about capturing ideas on what has to be thought about in this redesign process. It'll be built forward over the next 4 days, and we'll do some kind of audit and stocktake on Sunday morning to see how much of that has actually moved forward with significant momentum. Can I thank you all and say let's reconvene in here on Sunday morning.